right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lecture 8B, the Cold War in the 1960s. It will be dominated by Cuba and Kennedy early, but yet will be centered and focused around the Vietnam War. However, the first thing we need to talk about is Eisenhower's military or industrial complex. He brings this up in his farewell address. And so this is probably the second farewell address you need to know besides Washington's farewell address. And specifically because he warns about this idea of the private business and military being so close together and policies based on that. There'll be the need to keep this idea of a power, of having this huge standing army, which will happen after the Korean War, and will need our influence to keep business going. And that influence would only help business is if we're at war or we're close to a war. This arms race with the Soviet Union, which a great example is NASA in the 60s and early 70s, where you get this, like the city of Houston was nothing until NASA gives them their contracts, and it becomes a sprawling urban center that we see it as today. So he's really worried about this. He's also worried about the idea of democracy dying with this because of this complex. Now, JFK will take office in 1960. He wins a close race against Richard Nixon, who will come back later to become our president, but he loses to JFK. This young Catholic takes over, and he comes in with a different policy for the Cold War. It's flexible. It's not this idea of mad destruction, this mutual assured destruction by nuclear weapons, and this idea of brinkmanship. It's more of an idea, and he called it the flexible response. Okay, he wants to have, and he really thinks the future is in these third world countries. So he really wants to help these third world countries around the world to fight against communism. He's also very big into CIA covert operations, things like that. He's okay with that, but this idea of peaceful help. And we'll get two things we still see today: the Peace Corps, which you could join after you get out of high school, and then the USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. Two things that are still around to this day, and great examples of JFK's flexible response. Okay, and so we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Before we get there, remember that Fidel Castro comes into power in the 50s. He gains power, has a loose agreement with the Soviet Union, and he starts having some communist policies, although basically Cuba had been a business colony of ours. We slowly basically cut them off, and so their full allegiance, Cuba's full allegiance and alliance goes with the Soviet Union. Now, speaking of JFK's covert operations, we get the Bay of Pigs Fiasco, which is kind of the black eye for JFK's 3 short years in office. And it was a plan to have 2,000 exiles storm the beaches and basically start this coup in Cuba to get rid of Fidel. It was based on the need for air support for the United States, but when these exiles land, things are going wrong, and Kennedy gets scared and pulls this air support, which means it's an epic fail, and those 2,000 are basically rounded up and imprisoned and executed, and it was a big L for Kennedy. Now, this kind of brought about this idea that Khrushchev, who is now in charge in the Soviet Union, and Fidel can kind of push it. And so on August 14th, we will see recon photos of the Soviets building weapon silos that could hold nuclear weapons. On August 22nd, we will decide that we are going to, and really the Soviet Union's doing that in response to us having nuclear weapons in Turkey, about the same distance, and so the failure of the Cuban or the Bay of Pigs kind of emboldens Khrushchev to take this step. Kennedy's response is a naval and air blockade of Cuba, which results in the Soviet Union ships coming up to this blockade. What would happen? Would there be firing? Would this start the war? There's a lack of communication between the Soviet Union and the United States. People at home are panicking. We think it's going to be war. It could be the nuclear war we're all worried about. There's heightened tensions. People are going to the store and buying all types of foods to basically make it through this nuclear just Armageddon. And so we get that. However, there is negotiations. Publicly, we agree, the United States agrees not to attack. Khrushchev says he'll take all missiles out. Secretly, we tell the Soviet Union that we take those missiles out of Turkey as well, secretly. And so it looks like a huge victory for Kennedy because he stops nuclear weapons from being in Cuba. This will also set up a couple things. There will be a hotline between Moscow and Washington where the leaders can talk immediately. Also, this sets up the idea of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, one of our first treaties about nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union. At this time, basically, we can't test into space, okay, and cause a bunch of problems there. So we get that in 1963. Okay, this is from the movie 13 Days. Kevin Costner's in it. It's about those 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. These were the pictures that were brought up as evidence showing these missile silos being built, and a political cartoon that goes with it. Okay, and we can see Khrushchev sweating bullets, the United States calm, and we all have our fingers on this idea of using nuclear weapons. Now, as this is going on, Khrushchev and Kennedy will actually meet in Vienna. It won't be a very good meeting for Kennedy. Khrushchev will feel very confident in that meeting, throwing the punches, and many people would say he won that kind of standoff. At this meeting, though, JFK refuses to pull troops and basically give up West Berlin to East Germany and East Berlin, the Soviet Union. And so USSR starts building a wall, and there'll basically be United States tanks and Soviet Union tanks facing off there. And so they'll build a wall around West Berlin to make sure, not necessarily to keep people from leaving, but keep people from East Berlin going there. They were losing a bunch of the middle class, doctors, people who didn't like the Soviet Union and what they were doing and the low pay. They wanted to be capitalists. So they went into West Berlin so then they could go to West Germany. And so this wall was to try to stop that. And so this is going to be the symbol of the Cold War. However, the greatest event of the 1960s in terms of the Cold War is the Vietnam War. We talked about Eisenhower. He had this theory of the domino theory that if one country in Asia falls, they'll all fall. And so we want to take this stand in South Vietnam. South Vietnam isn't a thing until the French leave. And in negotiations, we make sure that it's split for at least a year. We get DM in there as, not DM, okay, it's not direct message. All right, DM in power. He is part of the minority. He is Catholic, which most of the population is Buddhist. But that's not the problem. The problem is he basically becomes a dictator. And so we will start helping DM. We'll send military advisors. Kennedy will kind of ramp this up. And then we start seeing the Viet Cong, which were really closely aligned with the North Vietnamese government. But they are basically the guerrilla fighters in South Vietnam. Diem loses the support of the people. This is where we see the famous pictures and videos of the Buddhist monks lighting themselves on fire in the middle of the street. We realize that we can't, if we want to save South Vietnam, we can't have Diem in power. And so we order a coup of Diem to put some military leaders in power that will more closely align with us. We have now put all our chips in with South Vietnam. Kennedy is assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson comes into power, and we get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Okay, we say North Vietnam's fired torpedoes at the USS Maddox. Kind of rings a bell with the USS Maine, Spanish-American War, and that we need basically to go to war. We do not declare war here, and this is a key thing. Korean War was a police action by the United Nations. Vietnam War is basically all on us, but we do not declare war. However, Congress gives the president all the power in the world and basically a blank check to go fight this. He starts sending in troops. As we continue troops, there's two strategies that come about. Attrition strategy that we can inflict more damage on the enemy than they could absorb, and at some point they're just going to have to give up. Okay, but guerrilla warfare and not knowing who the enemy was and who was friendly, and that could change from the day to the night, and having 18-year-olds who are drafted for a very short time just looking to survive, it doesn't work very well. We then continue this another kind of strategy of pacification. Basically, we want to pacify the Viet Cong by winning the hearts and minds of the people in South Vietnam. In these villages that we go to, it will turn into basically us just taking over the villages, relocating the villagers, throwing their whole life into complete chaos, which then makes them hate us even more, which makes many of them join the Viet Cong, and we see this problem. And so we're just going to get so swamped with this, and the home front's not going to help, which we'll talk a little bit more next week about with the lack of support from the people, because it wasn't a total war. The nail in the coffin was 1968, and might have been the coffin for Kennedy's Johnson's presidency as well, was the Tet Offensive, which was a surprise attack by the North Vietnamese. They'll get into cities all throughout South Vietnam, but by the end of the day, the United States and South Vietnam inflicted way more damage, but really the morale of the United States to continue fighting was over out of it after that. And so we'll get the ability of Nixon to come in and say he's going to get out of this war, although it's going to take him some years to do that. But the Vietnam War really, really, really was the main focal point of the 1960s in our Cold War policy. Although Kennedy had those early things, Johnson, it was all about the Vietnam War. And it will ruin many of his domestic policy agendas as well, because of how much time, effort, and money is going to be spent here.